Paul W.S. Anderson might now be best known for adapting video games into films, each of his movies seeming like an attempt to bring a beloved game to the big screen. He literally managed to turn the Resident Evil series into a full-blown franchise, which has its merits, even if some fans may disagree. But there was a time when he gave us a sci-fi film that would later have a major cultural impact on cinema, games, and even TV shows. We're talking about none other than the 1997 space horror adventure Event Horizon. With some recent developments around the film, it's worth asking, what the fuck happened to Event Horizon? But before we go into our explanation, we do have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Vision of a hellish Star Trek, Event Horizon. The 1990s were a period of genre experimentation, with filmmakers reworking familiar tropes through new and often darker lenses. Sci-fi and superhero genres, in particular, saw radical reinterpretations as creators aimed to present them with a tone unfamiliar to mainstream audiences. Paul W.S. Anderson had just made a name for himself with his video game adaptation Mortal Kombat, and studios were eager to sign him on for more projects they hoped would be surefire hits. Given the number of sequels and reboots floating around at the time, one would assume Anderson would be tapped to direct something familiar. Indeed, he was offered the chance to direct a sequel to Mortal Kombat, as well as an early adaptation of Marvel's X-Men. But Anderson wasn't interested. He wanted to move away from PG-13 territory and dive into something darker and more daring. That's when Paramount, sitting on Philip Eisner's original script for Event Horizon, re-entered the picture. Eisner had described the film as The Shining in space. Eisner later explained that the idea came from imagining a haunted house in space and how a space-time warp might affect the human psyche. But it wasn't just his love of physics that fueled the script. Eisner was also coping with personal tragedy. He had lost his father in a skiing accident, which pushed him into a dark mental space. When he first described the infamous blood orgy sequence to studio execs, they were horrified, which made sense, considering he detailed women reaching up to tear a man's throat out mid-coitus. Yet this didn't surprise Eisner, who completed the script's first draft in 8 months. Meanwhile, Anderson was looking for a project that could scare audiences the way Alien, The Shining, and The Haunting had. Event Horizon felt like the perfect fit. However, Eisner's original draft leaned heavily into alien-esque territory, featuring tentacled aliens haunting the ship's crew. Anderson decided to rewrite the script, shifting the horror into a different direction. He explained, "I didn't want Event Horizon to be an alien wannabe or ripoff. I felt the way to avoid that was to make it a Gothic movie and base it on one of the best pieces of Gothic architecture in the world, the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris." So the team scanned Notre Dame and digitally reconstructed its architectural elements to design the ship Event Horizon. Much of what we see in the film, from the sets to the gore, was practically created. While the gore wasn't real, the visual effects were made to look as realistic as possible. Credit goes to visual effects supervisor Richard Urasich, who had previously worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey and Blade Runner. When Anderson asked Urasich about the secret behind those films' legendary visuals, Urasich simply said, "We did stuff for real." With a cast that included Sam Neill, Lawrence Fishburne, Jolie Richardson, Richard T. Jones, and Jason Isaacs, Event Horizon literally depicted a journey to hell and back. Set in the year 2047, the film follows a rescue crew investigating the reappearance of the Event Horizon, a scientific research vessel that had gone missing years earlier. Captain Miller leads the mission to uncover what remains of the ship and its crew. They soon discovered that the Event Horizon had accidentally opened a portal to a hellish dimension. In the process of exploring the ship, the crew is forced to confront their deepest fears and traumas manipulated by the malevolent force now residing within. While Ridley Scott had drawn on the disturbing artwork of H.R. Giger for Alien, Anderson was inspired by the surreal horror of Hieronymus Bosch and the photography of Joel Peter Witkin. He wanted the film to be aesthetically rich, even when depicting the grotesque. Guillermo del Toro would later master that visual style, blending the beautiful and the horrific seamlessly. Anderson had full creative freedom to shape this nightmarish universe, and he didn't hold back. The result was a film that, while not initially successful, has become a cult classic. Decades after its release, fans still obsess over its visuals, themes, and lore. Production nightmare for this space nightmare. There were times when the production and the set design went to such levels of authenticity that the actors indicated there were moments when they didn't even have to act. According to Anderson, I heard from all of the actors individually at one point or another that they found the sets had a disturbing vibe to them. That's how I knew we were doing something right when people would go, "I love working with you, Paul, but I hate coming to work." It was just horrible. The feeling on set is just, and it was actually the sets themselves, because the crew couldn't have been nicer. But there was a disturbing vibe. I really felt like we created a very physical haunted house for the actors to interact with. The actors were confused by the script and tried their best to deal with the circumstances in which they were being put. In fact, none of them knew what the film was about, except for the vague idea associated with another dimension. Some of the actors confessed that they simply joined the cast because of the already good team and lineup of actors, and they felt it didn't seem important to have complete clarity on the plot. However, making something with a unique blend of sci-fi and horror could be difficult for both the makers and the special effects department. Meanwhile, the use of practical effects put the actors through a completely different horror of their own. Actor Jolie Richardson, who plays Lieutenant Stark, talked about several moments when the production actually felt cursed to her because of the bizarre occurrences. She shared 2 such instances. There was one scene with Sam Neill and me at the console. We were meant to be typing away, and then on a count of 3, there'd be a fake explosion and we'd throw ourselves back off our chairs. When Sam and I did the scene for real, there was the count of 3, and then neither of us remembered what happened next. The explosion went off and we woke up a few moments later on the floor. That happened every single time. There was a scene where Lawrence Fishburne and I were crawling down a tunnel and made it through a heavy door just before it slammed shut. So again, we rehearsed the stunt a million times because they were big steel doors. But I asked what would happen if the timing was wrong. The stuntman was up on the ceiling cueing the door to slam the minute I got through. But when we finally got to the stunt, there was so much smoke, he couldn't see me. He pulled the lever and my foot got jammed in the door. It was jinxed, but we all managed to have a laugh regardless. No wonder Richardson felt it was cursed. She had gone through a scene where she was doused with several gallons of blood, a scene that didn't make it to the final cut. Apart from that, there was the suit, the 65-pound spacesuit, and to depict certain scenes, the actors had to be suspended in these suits using fishing poles. Eisner mentioned a particular instance. The suits are very heavy and very uncomfortable, such that in between takes, they have to have a grip holding the backpack so the actor doesn't throw their back out. I'm walking through the room and I just hear this voice boom out, "Eisner!" I turn and it's Lawrence Fishburne, and he's looking at me. And he goes, You did this to me." But while this is happening at the front, Anderson was going through a crazy nightmare of his own as the studios pushed in their demands mid-production. The project was doomed from the beginning because of another film entirely, one that would go on to break the record by being the first film to earn $1 billion worldwide, Titanic. Paramount was working on the project along with 20th Century Fox, and it was supposed to be released on July 4th, 1997. But due to production trouble, its release was delayed. Realizing that the summer slot was open for another release, Paramount shoved Event Horizon into that slot, and thus began the post-production nightmare that would doom this film. At the time, the editing period provided to directors by the Directors Guild of America was 10 weeks. However, Anderson only managed to get 4 weeks to make his cut, forcing him to start editing while shooting in parallel. By the time he had started editing, 2 weeks of filming were left, so he was forced to work 7 days a week to make it to the deadline. Paramount's reaction and the director's cut that never got out. Even after all that trouble, Anderson managed to complete the cut, and even though the film was completed, the rush that the studio gave did have some impact on the overall look. The 130-minute cut shown to the test audience had a very interesting response, even though it had some incomplete effects and some rather obvious, hastily assembled bits, according to Anderson. I think Paramount was a little shocked. It had all this gross horror and all these disturbing images. I don't think anyone at the studio had really seen that stuff before because I was shooting in England. Generally, people from the studio watch what the main unit shoots, but all of the horror stuff was being done second unit, directed by me on the weekends. I don't think anyone at the studio actually watched the second unit material, so they hadn't seen all the impalings and all the other people getting their eyes out and the intestines. I got a lot of tough notes. In fact, one of the funniest things that was heard amongst all these responses was when one studio executive told Anderson that they are the same studio that makes Star Trek. Now, that's when you know that you have truly called all possible lines in the genre. The film was received poorly, and some of the audience members also fainted during the screening, none of which proved to be any help to Anderson. He was forced to cut the film to just 96 minutes, removing all the gore and anything else that fans spent years tracking down and seeking to understand Anderson and Eisner's true vision. We have another video that explains everything that was deleted and the years of process people spent seeking it out. Even though it's rather impossible to imagine if we will ever manage to get a director's cut for Event Horizon, it might be interesting to know what the alternate endings were going to be. Yes, there were 2 different endings, and also the other visuals of absolute horror that got chopped off and lost due to poor maintenance. The box office bomb, commercial failure in numbers. When this extremely short version of the film was released on August 15, 1997, it got heavily criticized, and it bombed at the box office, managing only to gross a total of $26,616,590 against a budget of $60 million. During the promotional run, Jason Isaacs remembers a particular instance that made them aware that the film had bombed. According to him, Larry Gordon hired a limo for us to do what he had traditionally done on many films, which was to drive around to different cinemas, stand at the back on the night of its opening, and just watch the reception. After we went to the first cinema, we went out to speak to the box office, came back to the car, and went, "Let's just go for dinner, shall we?" Why was Event Horizon criticized following its release? From a runtime of 130 minutes, the film was reduced to about 90 minutes, chopping off a large chunk of the gore and other plot elements that focused on raising the tension. One of the film's biggest criticisms was the style over substance, because the designs and the visuals were praised. Maybe there's a chance the entire chunk that the studio demanded to be lopped off the film had all the plot, and what was left involved the visuals. In fact, Anderson mentioned that the chunk of the film he had to eliminate significantly ruined the overall movie. In fact, James Cameron was able to give an interesting response to the reason behind the failure of the film, as actor Kathleen Quinlan mentioned. "I happened to be over at a friend's house and James Cameron was there, and I said, 'Why do you think it didn't work, Jim?' And he said, 'Because people want a manifestation. They want a manifestation of a creature or whatever.' And I said to him, 'But I think it's so much more interesting when it's a film tapping into all our subconscious fears and we're manifesting it.' And he goes, 'Yeah, but it's film.'" Another major criticism tagged along with the film was that it felt heavily inspired, to the level of being called derivative of such epic movies as Alien, Hellraiser, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's interesting considering that Anderson was trying to pay his homage to these films, and he succeeded in doing that. A little more time and a little bit more support from the studio might have changed the path for the film and brought a completely different outcome. There was a clear reason for Paul W.S. Anderson to have given up after failing at bringing to life a story that he truly wanted to commit to, but one interesting criticism actually helped him out. It won't be called a criticism, but his next star came to his moral support in an incident that Anderson shared. I was going to make a movie with Kurt Russell, and I screened the movie for Kurt. Afterward, he said, "Paul, I'm telling you now, in 20 years, that's going to be the movie you're really glad you made." Turns out, Kurt Russell was right, and Anderson had given the right amount of food for thought that his audience needed. From VHS cult to digital classic. It's absolutely crazy to imagine that many of the films that Event Horizon was inspired by saw a similar fate of being box office bombs, but managed to gain quite some interest in the years following their release. Event Horizon was distinct in several senses. The first being that while Alien had put a physical threat on the screen, Event Horizon's threat was very much psychological, and that just became a whole new level of horror. People started to show interest in the world that Anderson had created, and eventually there was an entire fan base that managed to give this space horror a cult status. Last year, Variety added Event Horizon as the 94th best horror film of all time. It deserves this spot. Fans demanded that Anderson get a chance to share his true vision in the form he wanted and release a director's cut, which has become quite a popular topic nowadays. But it's not the cause of the Snyder Cut, considering a lot of the unused footage for the film was discarded in a Transylvanian salt mine. In fact, after the footage was relocated, it became clear that the damage was done. Anderson said, "You'll never see the messed up version because we made Event before the kind of DVD revolution. You know, DVD ushered in this era when you had to have additional footage, deleted scenes, things like that. There was no call for that back when we were just doing VHS cassettes and laserdiscs, so the material just wasn't archived very well. But all hope is not lost, considering there are major studios that have shown their interest in the project, and the streaming platforms might be working out something that might allow us to revisit this hellish feat of cinema." According to Anderson, Lloyd Levin, the film's producer, was revealed to have a VHS copy of the 130-minute cut. Even though it has been about 13 years since this revelation, we have not given up on hoping to see the original cut. The science behind the madness. Ever since the early sci-fi films, there has always been the idea of influences, considering how the narrative is depicted, which becomes a big part of the genre and its larger depiction in the future. Even though Event Horizon's production might feel rushed, along with how the project was realized, both through the involvement of the director and the screenwriter, it seems over the years, the film has managed to include itself in the list of movies that might have had a strong influence on the genre as a whole. One of the most iconic scenes from the film involves Sam Neill's character, Dr. Ware, explaining the wormholes to the crew of the Lewis and Clark ship. It's a very simple explanation of how the wormhole manages to create a shortcut in the space-time continuum, allowing the spaceships and other such bodies to travel larger distances instantly. It's how he explains that becomes the important part of the narrative, as we can see him taking the poster that's supposed to represent the space-time continuum, which he then folds in half and punches a hole through the halves using a pen. The hole is the passage that the wormhole creates, and to be honest, it's actually a clear-cut explanation of the concept. The 2014 film Interstellar also uses the concept of wormholes as an essential plot point. During a scene where David Gyasi's Dr. Romilly is briefing Matthew McConaughey's Cooper about the wormhole, he uses the same means of using a piece of paper and a pen. The scene and particular explanation might have existed for a long time, but putting it across like that surely makes for a great moment for both fans and lovers of the genre. But that's not the only cool thing about the science in this masterpiece, considering that over the years, fans have noticed that Anderson and Eisner might have managed to bring in some elements of science. While the movie suggests that passing through the ship might have drilled quite deep into the fabric of space-time, there's a chance that it might have had some connection to the idea of quantum foam. So, according to John Wheeler's concept, there's a chance that the crew might have ended up exploring some frothy and turbulent journey because of the quantum fluctuations at the Planck scale. The hell that the crew goes through, and that we also get glimpses of, might not be an alternative dimension, but just the idea of someone going through the entropy-maximizing engine of the universe. The second law of thermodynamics backs this up, stating that entropy can only increase or remain the same in a closed system. Now, entropy is the measure of disorder, and the law completely reflects how normal life inside the universe and its core tendency tends to be improbable arrangements of matter. Life may defy entropy itself because of the continuous tendency to maintain order, and that's when the ship went too far, because it reached a region of maximal entropy. Thus, everything that was held together fell apart, like life itself and all its elements, identity, personality, and whatnot. Ultimately, they experience pure existential horror, a situation where life and its normality are an anomaly, and the universe wants to flip absolutely. Yes, there was some science to all that after all, and maybe it doesn't seem like we researchers will ever stop exploring the absolute nightmare that the crew experienced. In scientific words, it would be better to call it quantum decoherence. Future horizons, new projects, and continued interest. Over the years, there have been numerous attempts at bringing Event Horizon to the forefront in one way or another. While Paramount approached Anderson to work on the director's cut, other filmmakers the film had influenced wanted to make their versions of this story. Glenn Schofield, the creator of the Dead Space game, clarified that Event Horizon was a major influence on the game, and it is visible when you go through the game. It is crazy to imagine that Event Horizon was amongst a list of the major inspirations, as Chuck Beaver said. It feels like we have a love affair with the emotional journey and situation of Ripley in the first Alien movie. She's forced into an extreme circumstance and faces paralyzing terror at almost every turn and has to prevail. We have a lot of that. The dark and eerie atmosphere of Event Horizon, the uncomfortable sense of dementia in Solaris, and the desperation of Sunshine also have a presence in our game. We tried very hard to create our own look, feel, and art direction. Although we love sci-fi and horror and look to them for inspiration, it was extremely important to us to create a whole new universe and world. You know, Anderson was successful in what he was doing based on the very fact that his film was mentioned as an original attempt, along with some of the other films that he himself was inspired by. But it doesn't end there, because around 2019, it was announced that Amazon is working on developing a series for Event Horizon, and MonsterVerse director Adam Wingard was being targeted to helm the project. Even though much hasn't been released about the project yet, there's a chance that it might be developing somewhere in the back while we wait for Anderson's involvement. It seems that Adam Wingard has been too busy working on the project, but in the meantime, Event Horizon has discovered a whole new home for its expansion in a completely different but much-loved media. IDW will be releasing a 5-issue miniseries titled Event Horizon Dark Descent later this year, and it will be more of a prequel to the film, dealing with what happened to the crew of the Event Horizon. According to the series editor, Nicholas Nino, there are few films better suited for an expansion than Event Horizon. It's a strong, character-driven horror movie that hints at a whole other dimension we get to build upon, and build we shall. This is a creative team possessed by some dark and seductive muse, guiding their hands through a story in which evil never loses. Strap in now. Dark Descent is only the beginning of the pandemonium. And if you are wondering if it will do justice to Anderson's original vision, you should hear out Christian Ward. It's a huge privilege to be handed the keys of such a beloved film, one I take very seriously, and I have some extremely exciting things up my sleeve. Big, gory swings will be happening. You'll never see the film in the same light again. Marvelous verdict. Event Horizon might not click at first, but once you try to dig deeper, it becomes more and more like a nightmare and something that can't be easily forgotten. In the sea of movies that come out nowadays, hardly any have managed to stick around as something different. And that's exactly where Paul W.S. Anderson managed to hit the mark. Even though there might be numerous attempts to revive the film and make some other narratives out of it, there will be something about that 1997 film that will keep us wondering about what we witnessed. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe out there. Thanks, everyone.